Hey y'all, thanks so much for having me. I just came in from New York, actually. We've been flying around all over the place. My husband is here, and he just came in from Harvard, so it's been a really long travel to be here, but thank you so much for having me. I want to talk today about intersectionality and maps to justice. And I'm going to start just from earlier this year, I went to Afropunk, and it's a festival in New York City. And when I walked in, the first thing I saw was this amazing sign. No sexism, no racism, no ableism, no homophobia, no fat phobia, no transphobia, no hatefulness. And I wasn't excited because I assumed that the place would be devoid of any of these things, but rather it was the fact that this organization, this company, recognized that these are real issues. And these are real systemic problems, and they're engaged in a discourse both within themselves and with their audience about what it would look like to eliminate these things or address these things in the space that we're creating. And when we talk about intersectionality, we're not just talking about how those issues individually impact people, but rather how they collectively impact people, especially those of us who are particularly vulnerable, who sit at the intersections of many of those systems. I'm someone who's mixed race, and so often people will ask me to quantify the exact percentage of how much of a thing I am. And often, you know, the way that I respond to that is with some wisdom a friend of mine, Yumi Tamsha, gave me, which is that, you know, I am not fractions, I'm layers. So I'm South Asian, I'm African, I'm Native, I'm Venezuelan. All of these things are all happening at the same time. And I can't separate these conversations. I grew up listening to Spanish and Hindi, and both of those things are in me all at the same time. And similarly, when we talk about matters of justice around women's work or around ableism, all of those things have to happen at the same time. And for me, it is also a really important recognition that being an ally is not an identity, it's a process. So often with the way that we have access to education, we believe that there are things that we can master. That's literally a thing. People get master's degrees. But this is not the thing you master. This is about developing relationships and building humility and working collectively over periods of time to shift systems and make change. So researchers have estimated the total wealth of the world at $223 trillion. And I name this because I think this is a context to start to understand global ideas of inequity. Now, we know that 43% of the world's 43% of the world's wealth is owned by 1% of the world's population. And another way of thinking about this is that the 300 richest people have as much as the 3 billion poorest people. And so often, the kind of rhetoric that we hear about poverty is that those 3 billion people are lazy, as opposed to those 300 people are greedy. That we have a minimum wage, but we don't have a maximum wage that would impact the way that wealth is distributed. We know that prior to colonization, a few rich countries were only about 3 times richer than poor countries. And after colonization in the 1950s and the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. And now they're 80 times richer. And rich countries often like to compensate for this with the idea of aid. And so about $150 billion flows from rich countries to poor countries annually. But what is actually happening is $2 trillion is flowing in the opposite direction, from poor countries to rich countries. And that is why I don't like to use the term underdeveloped, but rather overexploited, to describe the accuracy of the relationship that's happening between the global north and the global south. And part of the reason why we don't get to hear these stories is because as long as there is a monopoly around money, there's also a monopoly around culture and media making. 3% of the decision-making in media comes from women. That means 97% of how women are portrayed is decided on by men. And men have a particular class and have a particular experience. And it's not that these men are not valuable or their stories are not important, but their stories can't be the only ones. We need multiple narratives and multiple experiences of people's truths so we can build something that is substantially more accurate than having one unilateral perspective speak on behalf of everyone else in the entire world. And this is something that has historical truth, too. I love this from Recess so much. And it says, take these history books with a grain of salt as they focus primarily on white Western males. And I remember when I was in school, and I was so frustrated because I felt like we never talked about anyone else. What were women doing? What were disabled people doing? What were people in so many different aspects of lives doing? So often what we do is focus on the soldiers and the wars and the times of incredible strife in our history, as opposed to the hundreds of years that Christians and Jews and Muslims have actually lived side by side and worked and built community together. And the absence of hearing those narratives constructs an idea around what the human condition is. And we really want to shift that. And I think it's important for us to talk about the different things that contribute to global inequity. And I think that a lot of the time we get distracted by this issue. And I think this is really deeply important, because even maps are a choice in politics. That there are more people living inside of this circle than outside of it. I hate the term minority, because 7 out of 10 people in the world are people of color. So the idea of suggesting that my issues are somehow minor is silly. And in truth, it's really reflective of the fact of a lot of people in the world. And truthfully, we are all interconnected, and our actions and our inactions impact each other powerfully. And that is why we want to be intentional about the way that we act with each other. And the way that we do that is by learning more about each other from each other. I often tell the story of when I was in my first year class of anthropology, and a friend of mine who was Mayan, we were listening to someone interpret the text in a way that she knew was inaccurate. So I told her, I was like, you should say something to this person. And she put up her hand and she said, this is a common misinterpretation of the text. I get this a lot. And the professor was like, I've been studying Mayan theology for 7 years, and it's my focus. And she's like, that's cute. I've been Mayan my whole life. And for me, it was just this realization that there's so much knowledge and wisdom around us, and if we continue to only look at the people with a whole bunch of letters after their name, we're missing out on so much of that wisdom. And so often what we have seen is that the strategy is not to talk about these difficult issues, but not talking about them has not made them go away. We know now that the millennials are just as racist as the baby boomers or a Generation X. There's really only marginal differences. So this strategy of ignoring a problem and hoping it's going to go away is not effective. And that racism doesn't always look like shouting slurs. It often looks like looking for a reason why a black boy deserves to die, or why a black girl deserves to get assaulted by a police officer. It's a deeper kind of conversation that the 3 women who created Black Lives Matter and the movement have been really trying to engender in a lot of different spaces. I think it's also talking about the way that in Canada, we actually have one of the lowest crime rates we've had in years, but we're undergoing the largest prison expansion since the 1930s. Prisons disappear people, but do not disappear social problems. And we know certain people are overrepresented in the prison system. Indigenous people only make up 6% of the population, but 30% of the prison population. And these issues persist outside of prisons. We know with enormously high food costs in Nunavut, heads of lettuce at $28.54, packages of water for $110. And people will often get caught up in this minutia of shipping costs, but alcohol is being priced exactly the same way. That since 1978, over $14 billion have come out of so many territories, and those communities still remain without running water. This is unethical, and as Canadian citizens, we have a responsibility to investigate that. And similarly, so often certain labor is invisibilized in order for us to feel as though we're independent. So much of the food in Canada is produced by migrant workers coming in from Jamaica and Thailand, kept in southwestern Ontario, not even able to eat the food that they're growing and producing for us. And this happens in ways that are large and in small. I think about the way that sexism impacts women, but also men who are policed for having any sorts of attitudes that may be conceived as feminine. That we are not interested in encouraging these ideas of nurturing and kindness and masculinity, or allowing there to be enough space for us to be the people that we genuinely are. Or watching the way that women's bodies are getting policed. Young women are getting sent home at exams for having too much shoulder showing. If we're saying that having boys have a distraction-free learning environment is more valuable than women being at school, like if a girl is too young to be wearing that, then she's too young to be sexualized. And we see that this is happening on the other end. This young woman she was deemed that her clothes were a provocation against secularism. So they were too long and too modest and made her seem too religious. And we have to recognize that, even though women have this experience of collectively experiencing gender-based oppression, it looks different in different contexts. But ultimately, what we're looking for is an increased amount of agency. When I think about gender diversity, I can't not think about sexual diversity and gender diversity, that there are more than two sexualities and that there are more than two genders. And that we can't allow institutions to be the ones who determine gender for folks. It has to be a self-determined process that we also respect when it comes out of other people's mouths. And this doesn't just look like one end being masculine and one end being feminine, but a recognition that some folks are also doing really gender diverse things, and maybe genderqueer or mouche or hijra. There is a cultural context for gender difference all over the world, and diversity is actually the rule and not the exception. That, in fact, the problem with gender is that it prescribes how we should be as opposed to respecting and recognizing how and who we are. And I think once we hear about all these things, it can be really difficult to get stuck in a place of feeling like, how have I not been aware of this, or how have I not been engaged in this process? But it's really important to remember that there's no such thing as reverse ableism or reverse sexism, that the problem with marginalization is that these communities don't actually have systemic power with which to oppress other people. So the reverse of ableism, the reverse of sexism, is liberation. And actually, that's what we're here for. So what does it look like for us to be transforming large and small ecosystems? What does this change-making work looking like all around the world? And I always say this to people: start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. The grass is greener where you water it. So often we think that we have to go somewhere else to another community to make really powerful change, but some of the most powerful change happens in our own homes, in our own communities, around people that we know really well. And I think that we don't often recognize that we are crueler than we think we are. I watch people go through great strides to avoid looking critically at themselves, to avoid saying, I was sorry and I'm wrong. I've seen people throw away love to avoid facing their insecurities and fears. If you love me and you see me doing that, please grab me, hold me tight, remind me that I'm great and I deserve opportunities to grow and ascend, even if they hurt and even if I'm ashamed. That ability to acknowledge when we've hurt someone and say, I'm sorry for what I did, not the way you feel, but I'm sorry for what I did and I want to do better. And I think it has a lot to do with the kind of culture that we're encouraging around us for young folks and folks around us. That so often what we get asked is, like, what do you do for a living? Like, how are you going to contribute to capitalism? Like, what's your hustle? And that's a good question. It's totally a relevant one. But I also want to know, like, what kind of person are you? Like, what does integrity look like for you? How do you grow yourself up into someone that you're proud of? And this is something that has to be just as intentional. We go to school to learn a whole bunch of different things, but what does that mean about the kind of human that you are? What does that mean about your accountability to other humans that are like you, and particularly other humans who are completely not like you? And I think about it really as a superpower sort of thing. So I have this thing where a lot of little kids in the world, and I don't totally know why this is, ask me why I'm a superhero, or they ask me if I'm a superhero, and I think normally it's because I'm usually wearing like really brightly colored tights, and like I have a lot going on, like the tattoos, and I'm usually doing a lot more than this. So, at first I'd be like, no, I'm not, but eventually I was like, you know what? Yeah, I am. And so are you. And so what's your superpower? Because what is a superhero if not someone who recognizes the kind of abject poverty and injustice in their communities and decides to commit themselves to changing it? Everyone has that within them. Everyone has the capacity to do that. And for me, my superpower is really around the way that I bring people together to help them access new opportunities and articulate the issues that are happening in their communities. And I encourage you to figure out what your superpower is. And these are so many different people all around the world who are engaging in some kind of superhero work. And I think that we can learn from this in a multitude of different ways. This young woman, Gabby Rodriguez, challenging stereotypes. She's a 17-year-old high school student, and she decided to pretend to be pregnant for 7 months at her high school to draw attention to the way that young teen mothers were being shamed and stigmatized. She collected all of the different things that people said about her and to her, and then had teachers and students get up in the assembly and read them all in front of the entire school to talk about what it would look like to actually support these women to be here, as opposed to pushing them out of their education. I think about the work of Generational work. You know, we're really borrowing this world from our kids. And so it's really important that we think about how we're taking good care of it and making sure we're planting seeds that will yield growth in generations to come. I think about Generation 5 and the amazing work that they're doing. They're in Oakland, and they're committed to eradicating sexual violence and gender-based violence within 5 generations. Their work on transformative justice is powerful and really involves so many different indigenous practices of healing. Sharing resources as often as we possibly can. When there was the beginning of the refugee crisis with folks coming from Syria, people created an Airbnb for refugees. When governments were saying no, people were saying yes. We have space and we can make it work, and we are going to find a way to do that. Recently, in France, they just passed a law that made it illegal for supermarkets to destroy edible food in an effort to cut waste. Still in Canada, grocery stores and restaurants all have to throw away their food. In places, they literally will lock them into dumpsters to prevent people from eating. Like, we have a responsibility to change those kinds of systems and structures. We have to make this world a more ethical one than the one that we were born into. It's not sufficient for us to just say it's always been this way. All of these systems were made by people, and they can be and will be unmade by people. In Peru University, they invented a billboard that makes 100 liters of drinking water per day out of thin air. Respecting agency. I think so often, we talked about this kind of before, but this image for me is really, really special. So these are a group of women, scientists, who last year sent a satellite to Mars. And so often what we're used to seeing is like a bunch of dudes in like lab coats. And these are women in saris with flowers in their hair. And I think that it is really important that we create the space for people to show up as they are, in culturally sensitive and culturally reflective ways, knowing that these women are geniuses and can do that in a skirt. I can wear eyeliner and talk about intersectionality at the same time. It's completely possible. And I think increasing accessibility, making sure we have things like interpreters and producing things in Braille, having childcare, thinking about all of the people who often don't get to access the spaces that we create. We don't want to speak on behalf of others. We want to make more space at the table for them to speak on behalf of themselves. And starting young. I love the Radical Monarchs. If you decide to follow them on Instagram, tell them I sent you, because I think that they're amazing. They're kind of like Girl Guides, but turned up. And they are a group of, under the age of 12, young girls who are committed to social justice work and are doing that in a little pack. And they're going around really connecting to other people in their communities and doing really profoundly awesome work. They're also hiring right now, in case anyone is interested. Maybe you want to head down to Oakland. And I think that that's a really great way. Often we don't believe that young people can handle these difficult conversations, but not only are they handling them, they're leading them. And I think media that speaks to generations and reminds us about our responsibility and our accountability to each other, that the way that we love each other is a good thing and a powerful thing, that unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. We need each other deeply in this work, and I think it's so important for us to connect to that process. And these are a whole bunch of strategies for solidarity. I like to leave it in here because my prezzies are public and free and shareable, but there's one thing I want to leave you with. So often, the golden rule is to treat other people the way that you want to be treated. And I think it is really important to treat other people the way that they want to be treated. We can't assume that we're the standard for other people's experiences, so it means we have to ask. We have to ask what gender pronouns are. We have to ask what cultural sensitivity looks like. We have to ask what safety looks like. And it's in the way that we ask and we talk to each other and we create those kinds of discourses that we create communities where none of us are left behind, because that is ultimately the goal. Even though this is hard, the hard work is part of what tells us that we're doing it right. So we don't want to turn away from each other when things get difficult. We actually want to turn towards each other with courage and keep moving forward together.